Good evening, everyone. My name is Nate Graham. I am a public engagement specialist with the Division of Transportation at Arlington County's Department of Environmental Services. And this is the South George Mason Drive Multimodal Corridor Study, second virtual public meeting in summer 2022. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to join the meeting before we get started. So I will leave the title slide up so you know you're in the right place, and we will see you in just a moment. All right, good evening once again. My name is Nate Graham. I'm a public engagement specialist for Department of Environmental Services. This is South George Mason Drive Multimodal Corridor Study, virtual public meeting, summer 2022. And I'm joined tonight by the project team from the county, as well as our consultants on this study from Tool Design. Our project manager is Leah Gerber, and our consultant team is led by Tina Fink and Wendy Phelps. So you'll hear from them in short order here in the presentation, but very briefly tonight, I want to go over the meeting agenda and cover a little bit about this Microsoft Teams Live platform for those of you who have perhaps not joined us on one of these meetings over the last couple of years. The meeting agenda tonight, we're going to quickly reintroduce the study. The first public engagement was in spring of this year, and we will cover the existing conditions engagement, as we call it, what we heard from you when we asked you to tell us more about how you currently experience South George Mason Drive and how you use it. We'll also cover the data collection and analysis that went into the first phase of this study, learning more about the volumes and speeds of motor vehicles, how pedestrians and cyclists use the corridor, and how that informed the development of what we're calling corridor-wide concepts. So this preliminary phase of the study, very early on, very early conceptual designs of how we can achieve the goals of this corridor study and implement Arlington's adopted transportation planning guidance, incorporate the feedback we heard from you, and make sure that it works with the data that we collected. At the end of that introduction of these corridor concepts, we will talk a little bit more about this phase of public engagement and cover the next steps for this and subsequent phases of the study. So very briefly, if you have not used the Microsoft Teams Live platform, you will be able to ask questions at any time during the presentation using this icon here, the little Q&A speech bubbles in Microsoft Teams, either in your web browser or on the application. You can, once you click that button, your question will pop up on the side. You'll be able to type in your inquiry or comments. Once we get those, we will take a look, and if we can respond during the presentation, we will. And if it's better left to the question and answer at the end of tonight's presentation, we will do so that everyone can benefit from the answers that the project team has. And at the end of tonight's presentation, there will be a recording available, as well as a list of everything that was submitted to the Q&A and the responses from the county and the project team within the Q&A platform, as well as a transcript. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to our project manager and our team leader for the South George Mason Drive study, Ms. Leah Gerber.
Thank you, Nate. I appreciate it. So like Nate mentioned, I'll be starting off with a study overview. Next slide. So the study goals. So the purpose of this study is to develop a plan to improve safety and access along South George Mason Drive for people walking, rolling, riding transit, cycling, and driving, what are really the components of a multimodal study. This study will really be informed by 4 components. So county planning guidance, like the master transportation diagram you can see here in Vision 0, data analysis and research, like Nate mentioned, traffic counts, interdepartmental coordination. So we've been working with, departments of Parks and Recreation and Transit on how we can make this study really benefit all departments. And then public engagement is obviously a huge part as well, which is what we're doing now, hearing from you about these concepts today. Next. So just a reminder of what we're going to be looking at with this study and talking about today. So this is an image of the study area. You can see it starts in this northern segment. This is Arlington Boulevard, or Route 50, and it goes 2 miles all the way down to the Arlington-Fairfax County line. So that's the entire study area. You can see there's a dash line here, and that's where we're doing a 15% design. So that basically means we're going to design this portion out really so we can submit grant applications. And this is really a timeline that's driving really this study. We're hoping to submit grant applications in the winter of this year and early 2023. So that's something we're keeping in mind as we're doing engagement. And corridor segments. So because it's 2 mile corridor, which may seem short, there's so many resources and just different things going on along South George Mason that we broke it up into 3 different segments. You can see here segment 1 is highlighted in yellow. That is from Arlington Boulevard to Columbia Pike. Segment 2, which is highlighted in pink, is Columbia Pike to South 4 Mile Run Drive. And segment 3, which is the teal color, is South 4 Mile Run Drive to the Arlington-Fairfax County line. And for anyone who is wondering, the cutoff is really closer to South Dinwiddie if you want an exact location on that. So existing conditions. So what we heard in those April engagements that Nate mentioned earlier on. So we had that community kickoff meeting that was online, similar to what we're doing now on April 6th. When we had that virtual meeting, we also launched an online feedback questionnaire and interactive map. And you can see we had really high response rates, which was great for that map. We had about 404 people submit 625 comments, which we'll be talking about shortly. We also had some in-person walking tours, really focusing on Barcroft, the area with South 4 Mile Run Drive, and Alcova Heights as well. Next, please. And so who did we hear from this online questionnaire? It was open for about a month, so we got to hear from quite a few people. You can see from this diagram here that a large amount of respondents were from this 22204 zip code, which is the zip code kind of around the South George Mason corridor. We heard from about 76% of people who live in Arlington, 42% who work in Arlington, and something that's important to note is that 5% of respondents said they had a disability that impacts their mobility, which is something we need to think about when we're talking about providing multimodal transportation for all on this corridor. Next, please. So travel habits. This was one of the questions that we asked on the questionnaire. So you can see here above this graph, it says, on a typical day, how do you travel on or around South George Mason Drive? And you can see, we have 91% driving and, walking, rolling, all these different modes. I think one thing that's important to note here is that people did respond to more than one mode. So the average number of modes, per person was 1.7. So 48% of people only answered one mode, which means that a majority of respondents answered that they use more than one mode on South George Mason. So most people who drive, are also using other modes of transportation like biking or scootering, transit, etc. Another thing to draw your attention to is the 70% using the corridor to reach destinations on or near South George Mason. We really want to make, multimodal transportation efficient and something that's moving people around, but also an enjoyable experience, especially for people who are trying to reach destinations along the corridor. Next, please. This was another question that we asked on that questionnaire. So overall, how safe do you feel while traveling along South George Mason Drive using the following types of transportation? So you can see with biking and scootering, which we have first, we have a large amount of people that responded they, feeling very unsafe or unsafe. As we progress to walking and rolling towards the middle of that chart, you can see we have some people feeling unsafe still, neutral, a few more safes. And then as we get to, driving and transit, it seems like people are feeling, neutral or more safe. So there's a pretty, large difference between biking and scootering and, people's perceptions of safety while driving and taking transit. Next, please. And so another question that we asked, you can see above the graph once again, what are the changes that you would like to see on this specific section, Arlington Boulevard to Columbia Pike? I should note that generally we ask us for the 3 segments and they were generally all the same. You can see here, majority of people, or the highest percentage, said safer intersections, followed by protected bike lanes, slower vehicular traffic, and additional crosswalks was also, quite high as well. So this was one of the maps that people could drop comments on. This was a specific concern-based comment. So you can see some things we pulled out here. One says there's a lot of traffic leaving the Foreign Service Institute while the cars on George Mason are moving quickly. Not comfortable crossing the street here, whether on car, bike, or walking. If you skip down to the 3rd bullet, we have the travel lanes are narrow with all the large vehicles parking along this route. Buses are often cross the line and taking up 2 lanes. Also, we need to make it easier and safer for kids to get to and from school and for everyone to get to community events. There are multiple schools like Wakefield, along this corridor, so that's very important. I think another thing that we were really hearing from this is a major concern from intersections from the public. And this next phase of the study, so phase 3, will really dive into more details at intersections, and this will help us better understand how to apply the preferred concept along the corridor. So we heard those comments on intersections, and we will be addressing those in the next phase. Next, please. And here were just a few comment themes. Like we said, we had about 625 comments, so we grouped those into general themes. You can see in this first bullet point, regardless of how people traveled, many road users focus comments on complex intersections at Arlington Boulevard and 4 Mile Run Drive. And you could see on that map I mentioned earlier, 4 Mile Run Drive and Columbia Pike are both Vision Zero crash hotspots, meaning that there's a large amount of crashes at these intersections. The second bullet point, entering South George Mason Drive from driveways and side streets, was another top concern. It was most prevalent amongst people who were driving to the Foreign Service Institute or National Affairs Training Center. And then third bullet point, people cycling were particularly challenged by Columbia Pike and the A Street intersection. So once again, that concern with intersections that we will be working on for phase 3. Next, please. So this is data collection and analysis. For this phase of the study, we completed data collection to understand, how many people are using the corridor today. So next slide. We looked at sidewalks along the corridor and crossings, which is what you can see here. We did an inventory to see what is existing, but what I think is important to talk about here is the existing planning guidance like the MTP and Vision Zero. Those are components that are going to shape this study. So the pedestrian element of the MTP that was published in 2011 states that mid-block crossings should be considered where crosswalks are more than 800 feet apart and there's a high amount of people crossing. And we also have some more recent guidance that really builds off of this. And it has more specifics like, having more crosswalks where they're pedestrian generators, which are places where people want to walk, like a school like Wakefield or a park like Alcova Heights or a library. And there's more specifics, when we start talking about trail crossings, which we have, with the WNOD or anything meant to be a school crossing. And I think, the most significant is talking about, some updated guidance where crossing should be 500 feet apart. Like I mentioned, that'll be kind of the next phase of the study. And we also focused on transit. So here's, some of the routes that we have that travel along South George Mason. I think it's important to note that South George Mason is a transit priority corridor, and there is high ridership. So transit infrastructure needs to function efficiently and safely. And that's really where, having standards like this 11-foot minimum for bus lanes comes into play. We also have bike infrastructure. You can see here, we have a cabbie station. This map kind of shows the different facilities that we have. In green, we have off-street trail like the WNOD and 4 Mile Run Trail. We have portions of bike lane in blue, a large portion of Sharrow conditions in yellow. And I think one thing to focus on specifically is that dashed yellow line, which is the Master Transportation Plan bike element, has this as a recommended bike route, but it is not in that state at the moment. You can also see the cabbie or the capital bike share along the corridor. So we have a lot of different types of bike facilities right now along South George Mason Drive. And also we looked at how people are driving and using South George Mason, specifically at parking. That was something we heard from people too with the first round of public engagement. So we went ahead and looked at, where there's residential permit parking versus unrestricted on-street parking, and kind of where those issues are happening based on topography and curves in the road. And that's something I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. Thanks, Nate. So like I mentioned, data collection helps to show how many people are using the corridor today. And this map shows the locations where this data was collected. And so really what we're trying to see here is the capacity of the road. Can we increase the capacity, which is really the goal of the MTP, increasing that capacity in order to move more people. And next slide. So right now we're looking at data analysis volumes and peak hours. So volumes really show how many people are on South George Mason at different times of day. So the busiest time of day or when there are the most cars, buses, etc. This is the peak hour. There was some, pretty typical patterns that we found from the data we collected. Each 7-day count location, there's a very distinct, weekday, morning and afternoon peak. The peak or PM peak generally experiences higher traffic and for longer than the AM peak, which is just interesting and something we need to think about for increasing capacity. It's also important to note that northbound volumes are higher during the AM peak and southbound volumes are higher during the PM peak. And generally speeds tend to drop slightly during these peak periods, which you can see here. The AM peak period is about 7:30 to 8:30, with the PM peak period being 5 to 6 p.m. Next slide, please. We also looked at volume and speed and that relationship. You can see here the posted speed on South George Mason Drive is 30 miles per hour. During school, through Vision Zero, there's a school slow zone. So the speed limit at Wakefield High School during school hours is 20 miles per hour. And that was shown on the map. We also have a chart here that just shows speed and volume data on South George Mason Drive, divided into the 3 segments. You can see we have, generally people are around that 30 miles when we're looking at the average speed, but when we look at that 85th percentile speed, we can see we are going up significantly from that 30 mile per hour. I think another thing to mention is just thinking about, why do we care about vehicular speeds, especially in relation to a multimodal study? So, when a car is going, or a person is driving a car and it's going 20 miles an hour, there's a 13% chance of a pedestrian fatality or injury. But if we look at a car that's going 30 or 40 miles an hour, that chance of injury for someone walking or biking or getting off the bus really increases. And, reducing the speed limit is something that will be considered as part of this project. The county is currently evaluating all streets, with speed limits that are 30 miles per hour or greater to determine if they could be part of, this Vision Zero initiative to really lower speed limits. And this study is going to help coordinate that effort. Next slide. And this also illustrates the driving speeds. We heard from you all from the first round of public engagement that a lot of people were concerned about vehicular speeds or driving speeds, and you can see that we did find that we do have a speeding issue on South George Mason Drive, really on all segments. And like I just mentioned, that is something we will be looking at. The next slide, please. So we also have crash data. So essentially, you can see here we had about 256 crashes that were reported here from 2016 to 2020. 92% of these crashes involved motor vehicles only, and notably 90% of reported bike and pedestrian crashes resulted in injury, while only 20% of crashes involving motorists resulted in injury. So we're seeing here that even when there's a small amount of bike or ped crashes, the impact is great. So really, we're trying to eliminate any fatalities or any injuries through any sort of crash through Vision Zero, but there's definitely a need for that along this corridor. You can see we have bike crashes here, pedestrian crashes where people are, getting injured. And then I think the other thing to note is that crashes sometimes go unreported, especially for pedestrian and cyclist crashes. So it's important to also hear from those who use South George Mason about their experiences, and we're really using that qualitative data and the comment map to kind of learn more about that. So next slide, please. And so measures of effectiveness. So really, why are we collecting this data? How are we going to use it? And how are we really going to know if what we're proposing is going to be effective? That's where these multimodal measures of effectiveness, or MOEs, really come into play. So these are what's being evaluated for today's conditions and future estimated conditions based on estimates like changes to population and employment in the county and in the region. So the first one we have here is motor vehicle operations. And this kind of can be divided into three subcategories. We have volume to capacity, and this compares the actual number of cars to the theoretical capacity of the street. So how many cars can we have with this increased capacity that I mentioned earlier? Delay, level of service. So delay is the number of seconds for a motorist to travel through an intersection on average, and a level of service assigns letter grades for different delay ranges. And queues, which is length of queues, basically how much motorists will back up in a given time. Bicycle level of stress assigns one of 4 levels of stress, basically on perceived safety and comfort of a cyclist next to moving traffic. Really factors in a number of things like number of lanes, widths of lanes, vehicular traffic volume, and speed is a huge component as well. Person capacity, how many people, not just cars, that each option can move an hour. So transit obviously is moving, more people than a single occupancy vehicle. Pedestrian crossing stress. This also assigns one of 4 levels of stress based on perceived safety and takes into, factors like traffic volumes. Is there a median? Once again, speeds, and then presence of, any sort of crossing treatments like bump outs. And pedestrian delay. So pedestrian delay is strongly related to pedestrian satisfaction, and as delay goes up, people are more likely to cross when the space between cars is small or against a signal, meaning they're crossing, when it doesn't say to walk, because of the delay. So those are some of the measures of effectiveness that we will be looking at. And so now we're going to look at some corridor-wide concepts, and this is really what we're focusing on in this phase. Like we mentioned earlier, phase 1 was really existing conditions. Phase 2, what we're in right now, is corridor-wide concepts, and phase 3 is going to be intersections. Before we kind of get into this, I want to preface that all graphics really show typical conditions for each segment of the corridor. The dimensions and the context do vary with each segment. Like I mentioned, when we move into phase 3, we're really going to be looking more closely, with specific conditions block by block and at intersections. And then, all these concepts identifies ways to add a continuous bikeway, either through a separated bike lane or a trail, and to widen sidewalks and to widen plantable buffer strips. To provide these additional features on the corridor, there may need to be trade-offs, or there will have to be trade-offs, such as parking removal, additional right-of-way needs, median reductions. We're really early on in this project process and are interested in understanding people's priorities regarding these trade-offs. So there will be more engagement as the project advances into design and construction regarding changes to right-of-way, but today we really do want to hear about your trade-offs. And with that, I will finally talk about the corridor-wide concepts. Next slide. Once again, because we did break these concepts up into the segments, segment 1 from Arlington Boulevard to Columbia Pike, segment 2, Columbia Pike to South 4 Mile Run Drive, segment 3, South 4 Mile Run Drive to the county line. Okay, so this is a rendering of what's here today. You can see in that upper corner, there is a map that shows segment 1, like I just mentioned. So what do we have here today? You can see we have, starting from the outside, we have about 4-foot sidewalks, generally a 3-foot buffer strip. We have 7 feet of parking on both sides. We have 12-foot lane, an 11-foot lane, and a 6-foot median that's generally grass. And you can see we've kind of included some of the uses along the side of the road here. So what we're talking about for segment 1. So each segment will have 2 concepts, concept A and concept B. First, we'll show you a visual of what it will look like, and then we will get into some of the benefits and the challenges. So this is concept A. You can see the main difference here is that there is a separated bike lane that has been added on both sides. Another key difference is that sidewalks have been widened to 6 feet, and there's a plantable buffer between the sidewalk and the bike lane that is also 6 feet. The bike lane has the 6 feet itself and then has a buffer of 3 feet with precast concrete barrier curbs, or sometimes known as concrete pillows. And the vehicular lanes are 11 feet and 10 feet, so have been narrowed slightly, and that center median has not changed. Next slide. So what does this mean? So we have some benefits here. Clearly, it separates bikes, motor vehicles, and pedestrians by providing that wider sidewalk, more of a median or a buffer strip, I should say, between bikes and pedestrians, and then also separating cyclists from cars. Widening that sidewalk does meet ADA and county guidance. When we increase the width of that planted buffer on the side, there are more possibilities for, vegetation and tree coverage or tree canopy. This provides a low stress bike facility, meaning that it's separated from vehicular traffic and kind of the other factors that we talked about with, vehicular speeds. And the curb stays in the existing location, which may reduce construction cost. I think it's also important to talk about some of the challenges. So this actually increases the number of lanes that pedestrians need to cross. It removes on-street parking. It requires additional right-of-way behind the curb for wider sidewalks. And it also requires additional design consideration for transit stops because we are adding those bike lanes. It may require signal phasing changes just to reduce conflicts between people driving and walking and biking at intersections, especially where there's high volumes or high amounts of turning vehicles. And there is possible tree removal associated with this concept. Next, please. So this is segment 1, concept B. So we're looking at that same segment. This is just another concept. So we've shifted from that separated bike lane here to really look at a 12-foot multi-use trail. So just shifting to think about what we changed from the existing conditions. So we have widened that sidewalk to 6 feet on one side and to 12 feet on the other. There is now a 6-foot plantable buffer rather than 3 foot. Parking is 8 foot on one side, and the vehicular lanes are 11 and 10 feet respectively, and that center median has remained the same. I'll talk a little bit about benefits. So once again, similar to concept A, it separates people biking and those driving from vehicles. It provides a low stress bike facility. It does widen the sidewalk on the west side. It increases, the width of the planted buffers on both sides, which increases opportunities for vegetation and tree coverage. It adds a new multi-use trail connecting multiple county parks like Doctor's Run and Alcova Heights Park. It connects 3 significant regional trails. So key regional trails are the WNOD and 4 Mile Run Trail. We are also doing a study of the Arlington Boulevard Trail, which will look at the Arlington Boulevard Trail to South George Mason Drive, and also reducing conflicts between people and biking and transit vehicles when compared to concept A. Because with concept A, the bus would need to kind of find a way to go in the bike lane. This concept eliminates that, so the bus would just pull up to the curb. Concept B, challenges. So similar to A, it requires additional right-of-way width for wider sidewalk and trail. It removes on-street parking on one side. It would also require signal phasing changes to minimize left turn conflicts with people using the multi-use trail. It would also need to balance construction costs with aesthetic requirements in residential areas, and it is associated with possible tree removal. So that is segment 1, both concepts A and B. So moving on to segment 2. So now we're looking at Columbia Pike to South 4 Mile Run Drive. You can see that in the upper corner highlighted in yellow. So what's here today? What's existing? So starting from the outside and moving in, we have about 5 feet of sidewalk on both sides, about a 4-foot planting strip, 7 feet parking, and 12-foot and 11-foot vehicular lanes. We have a sharrow condition, and then about 20 feet of median in the center. Next slide. So concept A, similar, well, really the similar concept to segment 1. We have that continuation of the separated bike lane here. So once again, I can start on the outside, highlighting the differences. We have a sidewalk that was widened from 5 feet to 6 feet, a plantable buffer that was widened to 6 feet as well, a 6-foot bike lane, 3-foot buffer, and we've reduced the vehicular lanes and kept the median the same in this condition. And so what are some of the benefits and challenges associated with this separated bike lane, widened sidewalk and buffer? Separates the bikes, motor vehicles and pedestrians. It widens sidewalks to meet ADA and county guidance. It does increase the width of planted buffers, so it increases possibilities for vegetation and tree coverage. It does provide a continuous low stress bike facility, and the curb does stay in the same location, reducing construction costs. Some of the challenges: it requires additional right-of-way width behind the curb for wider sidewalks. It does increase the number of lanes that pedestrians must cross. It removes on-street parking. It requires additional width behind the curb for wider sidewalks, and also additional design consideration for transit stops, once again, having the bus kind of meet at the bike lane to get to the curb rather than just going straight to the curb. It would also require signal phasing changes and possible tree removal. We also have concept B. So this is once again looking at Columbia Pike to South 4 Mile Run with this multi-use trail, widened sidewalk, widened buffer option. What are some of the changes here? We still have that 6-foot sidewalk, 6-foot plantable buffer on both sides. We do have parking remaining with 8 feet and vehicular lanes at 11 with that 20-foot median and the 12-foot trail. So some benefits and challenges. So separates bicycles and motor vehicles, provides continuous low stress bike facility. It does widen the sidewalk to meet ADA and county guidance. Once again, has that planted buffer to increase vegetation and tree coverage. It does add new multi-use trail, which connects to park, and then it also does connect or could connect to those 3 significant trails, 2 existing, 1 in the works. And it reduces conflicts between people biking and transit vehicles compared to the concept with the separated bike lanes. Challenges: requires additional right-of-way width for wider sidewalks and trails in some segments, requires some parking removal to maintain sight distance at intersection and driveways in segments 2 and 3, requires signal phasing changes to minimize left turn conflicts with multi-use trail users at intersections. There's high volumes of turning vehicles, so places like South 4 Mile Run Drive and Columbia Pike. And this design will need to balance construction costs, with residential requirements, and then also possible tree removal. And next slide. So this is the final segment. So this is South 4 Mile Run Drive to South Dinwiddie Street around the Arlington-Fairfax County line. So this is what's here today. So there's 4-foot sidewalks on both sides, about 3-foot planted buffer, 7-foot parking on both sides. All of the vehicular lanes are 12 feet and about 24-foot median in the middle of the road. So next slide. So this is what this segment could look like with concept A, which is separated bike lanes. You can see we have that widened sidewalk, 6 feet, planted buffer strip, 6 feet, same with the separated bike facility with that 3 feet. And we have reduced the vehicular lanes. I think it's important to note that we always have to leave that outside lane at 11 feet in order to accommodate buses. And in this condition, the median remains at that 24 feet. Next slide. So the concept and the benefits are similar to the other segments for this separated facility widened sidewalk scenario. It does separate bikes, cars, pedestrians. It widens the sidewalk to meet both ADA and county guidance. There is an opportunity for additional vegetation and tree coverage, having these 6 feet, on both sides. It does provide a low stress bike facility throughout, and because the curb stays in the same location, it could reduce construction costs. Similar challenges: it increases the number of lanes that people have to cross when crossing the street by foot. It removes on-street parking. It requires additional right-of-way width behind the curb in order to achieve those wider sidewalks that are ADA compliant. Requires additional design consideration for transit stops. May require signal phasing changes and possible tree removal. And concept B. So once again, we're bringing back that multi-use trail, widened buffer, widened sidewalk scenario here. So you can see we have 6 feet on one side, 12-foot trail on the other. That's 6 feet of plantable space, 7 feet of parking on both sides. All vehicular lanes are 11 feet, and that median has been narrowed to 14 feet. And some benefits: once again, it separates people biking and people who are driving vehicles, and it also provides that low stress bike facility. All of the sidewalks would meet the ADA and county guidance. It increases the width of the planted buffer, so you could have vegetation and tree coverage. Because it is a multi-use trail, it connects to significant regional trails, like I've mentioned, and then also connects to those county parks. And it reduces conflicts between people biking and transit vehicles when compared to concept A with the separated bike lanes. Some of the challenges: it does narrow the median to provide space for wider sidewalks, which could result in tree removal. It requires some parking removal to maintain sight distance at intersections and driveways in segments 2 and 3. It would require signal phasing changes to minimize conflicts, specifically at intersections, and it would probably require additional design consideration in residential areas, things like thinking about how it would interact with driveways, sidewalks, things like that, and then also possible tree removal, as we mentioned. Next slide. So that was quite a bit of information that we can review in the Q&A. I will pass it back to Nate to talk about public engagement and next steps.
Thanks, Leah. So we are in the beginning of this phase of public engagement, again, focused on those concepts that you just saw with Leah. And so I want to highlight the three, where we are in that timeline. We are at the height, the beginning of the height of our public engagement. We are really in a two-way dialogue with members of the public, yourselves, attendees, folks who fill out the online feedback form, about these concepts, about the trade-offs that are contained therein, and about getting community feedback on how we meet the goals of this study. So I have a couple of questions already in the queue, which is great. We are going to talk about that as we get into the discussion here. But before we do that, I want to just point out we are here. We have another phase of involve level community engagement with the workshop on intersection concepts, the next phase of public engagement, and in the fall, and then we'll move into commission briefings and the finalization of the study report towards the end of the year. This project is on a fairly accelerated timeline because we aim to submit applications for grant funding for capital projects for that segment 2 and segment 3 of the corridor to implement some of the recommendations of the study when they are finalized. But again, we are at a fairly preliminary moment in the study, so we are here to talk about trade-offs. So how will we do that? You are here tonight at the virtual public meeting, and we will be here for another 45 minutes or so answering questions. We're also going to share a recording of the meeting for everyone to take in, and then we'll have slides for tonight's presentation posted in multiple languages later this week or early next. We are also kicking off public comment in an online feedback form, much the same as we did in the first round of public engagement. That will run from today. It is live on the website now, if you care to take a look, to Sunday, August 7th, 2022. That online feedback form is available in 7 languages, including English, and is available on the website and is linked in QR code form on the back of a mailer we sent out to residents in and around the South George Mason Drive corridor. We sent out about 15,000 postcards to try and reach as many people as possible on the corridor and hear from them in the language they feel comfortable sharing feedback with us. Additionally, we are going to have an in-person community workshop. This is going to be an open house style public meeting at Randolph Elementary School right off the corridor, right there in Douglas Park. We are going to be there on Wednesday night from 5 to 7 p.m. just behind Doctors Run Park, right off the South George Mason Drive corridor. And we will be there with folks who can speak English and Spanish, and then also have materials for the workshop available in all of the languages you see on screen. So in addition to those opportunities, the online feedback form is live now, will be available through August 7th. We'll be promoting that through all of the county's various channels. And we ask that if you have an organization or group of people who use South George Mason Drive, who live near there, work near there, play near there, that you share that feedback opportunity and the recording of this meeting with them so that we can gather their feedback on these concepts as well. All right. A brief thank you on behalf of myself and the project team before we jump back into the concepts. I have 4 questions in queue, but now is the time for you to submit your questions. If you'd like to take a look at the conceptual designs, there's a PDF on the project webpage, which you can find by going to arlingtonva.us and searching South George Mason Drive. And you can actually there's a PDF of some of the presentation slides you saw tonight, the ones that focus on the conceptual designs, the concepts for the corridors in each segment. If you want to take a closer look at anything you've seen on screen, we're also going to bring them back up here. on the screen. So I'm going to start with a first question from Elizabeth, and most of my questions tonight are going to be directed to Leah. But again, we do have our consultant team with us tonight, Tina Fink, our project lead from Tool Design, and Wendy Phelps, who are here to answer questions as they come up. So Leah, jump back on screen and join me. I have a question from Elizabeth, which says, how does your study conducted this spring account for the fact that many people in this area are still working from home and traffic counts are significantly lower than it will be when employee commutes resume? By what factor do you scale up these numbers to account for full capacity? So this sounds like it'll be a good question for you to start off, and maybe we can go to Tina for a little bit more information about the traffic counts and how we're accounting for COVID-19's impact on the travel pattern.
That's a great question. Like you mentioned, people are, still working from home, and the counts that we did collect were in March and some, I believe, in early April of this year, where traffic patterns are looking a little different than maybe they did in early 2020 and 2019. Luckily, we have some traffic data that was taken pre-pandemic, you could say, and we're using that to kind of look at possibilities. Some of the crash data, like we mentioned, was as early as 2016. So we do have some data that we're looking at that was taken pre-pandemic and kind of cross-referencing with what we have now to determine, maybe what are things going to look like in 2024 and 2025. I'll pass it over to Tina for kind of more detailed technical response. That's kind of a general overview.
Yeah, sure. So I think a couple things, with the timing of those counts, a lot of people have gotten sort of into a new normal pattern. Many office workers sort of in a hybrid work pattern, some at home, some at the office. So I think that was just sort of the general thinking there with the timing of those counts. But in addition to that, something else that we're doing, so we did those counts that were this year, 2022. We're also taking a look at a future condition, which is 2045, that's using the regional travel demand model that takes into account population and employment changes, and looking at another scenario that is more of a growth scenario, to kind of see how things would function and operate for all users in that scenario.
Thanks very much for that additional context, Tina. I have we're going to move here to the next question. Question from an attendee here. I'm going to wait for my computer to load my question queue once again. Okay, the next question is about parking. A question from one of our attendees tonight. Many homes located on segment 1, so that's the segment here that you see on your screen from Arlington Boulevard to Columbia Pike, do not have any off-street parking. Where exactly do you envision people will park, and how will they access their homes? Have we considered the impact this will have on home valuation? Leah, let's talk about trade-offs.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is there is, residential permit parking. This is a RPP zone. So we do have kind of a general idea of who does and doesn't have off-street parking. We will kind of look at that as these progress. I don't think it's many people who have, absolutely no parking, but like they mentioned, it goes back to trade-offs. We heard from the first round of public engagement, people wanted separated bike lanes. We need to maintain, transit ridership and improve, bus stops. People also wanted to keep vehicular lanes, but also widen sidewalks. So really at some point, there has to be some sort of trade-off. I think these are really broad, kind of general concepts. Like I mentioned, as we progress to the next phase, we will look at on a block by block basis. Segment 1, Concept A generally talks about removing parking throughout the corridor, whereas Concept B talks about kind of spot parking removal, and that's where that really, more granular block by block is really going to focus.
Right. Thanks for that, Leah. All right, moving into the next question here. And again, this is the time for you to submit your questions. if you have any on these concepts. If you want to take a closer look, you can chime in on the in the Q&A box if you'd like me to highlight one of the concepts on one of the segments, or if you'd like to take a look at that document I referenced earlier. It's live on the project page now. You can take a look at these slides for the different concepts yourself and use them to formulate your question. So next question we have here, also related to parking. Why do the plans propose eliminating parking in the segment 1 area, but areas south of Columbia Pike get to keep parking? Let's talk a little bit more about how parking is impacted at various segments here.
Maybe we could pull up segment 1, concept A, and start from there.
Here we go.
So concept A, which is the separated bike lanes, widened sidewalk, and widened buffered, this talks about parking removal in all segments, so segments 1, 2, and 3. So I think this question may be referring to concept B, which is the multi-use trail. It removes parking in certain situations like intersections or, kind of little spots that we'll really talk about in that next phase as we go block by block. But I don't believe we're just removing parking anywhere.
I do see one of the primary changes between segment 1 and segments 2 and 3 is perhaps the amount of right-of-way available, because in concept B for segment 3 and segment 2, there is parking maintained on both sides of the street, whereas in concept B segment 1, that parking on the east side adjacent to the park is eliminated. So maybe we can highlight a little bit of the difference there in terms of existing right-of-way.
Yeah, so that, like Nate just says, goes back to existing right-of-way. So you can see, there we go. So you can see here, you have this kind of blue bracket underneath that has existing right-of-way, which is really what we're looking at now. And then you can see kind of a little bit how the sidewalks at 6 feet expands to either side. So we're really working in kind of this limited space. Where one of the benefits, I guess, of concept A is we're not, rebuilding or moving out the whole right-of-way, the whole curb. So there would be some cost savings associated with that. So really concept A is kind of staying within the limits of existing right-of-way and moving things behind the curb rather than within the curb, which would include parking.
All right, so that's a good primer on that question. I'm getting some more. I think I've seen a couple of really good ones in here. So we got a couple coming up. Got a question from Jason that's coming next in the queue. Jason asks, can you provide an example of a 12-foot shared use path already in use in the county adjacent to a similar road?
I think the first thing that comes to mind would probably be the WNOD in certain aspects is adjacent to generally arterial roads. It does vary. Sometimes it's 10 feet, sometimes it's wider. But yeah, the WNOD, I think would be a good example. It is not owned by the county, which is interesting. It's owned by Nova Parks and managed by them, but it does function similarly. There are some, pretty large intersection crossings, including at South 4 Mile Run Drive and South George Mason Drive. You do have, destinations that people are trying to reach. There are bus stops along the trail, similarly to what we have here. So I would say the WNOD functions similarly.
Sure, and I have another example too, which is the recent, and this one is a 16-foot trail, but the recently renovated Custis Trail on Washington Boulevard, on US 29 in Roslyn is another example of a multi-use trail directly adjacent to an arterial road with a high speed limit. It's just for a few blocks, but that 16-foot trail from the Air Force Association building, I don't remember the cross street, down to where the Custis Trail heads towards Theodore Roosevelt Island is another example of the sort of cross section that would resemble the concept you see here in concept B, this one in segment 2, where you have a multi-use trail, a buffer, and then an adjacent roadway. So I think that's a great question. Where does this condition exist elsewhere in the county? And I also know that we've been working on some what we call precedent images for these concepts using Arlington examples and examples from around the country. for the boards at our community meeting on Wednesday. And if you're not going to be able to make the community meeting, you will be able to see those boards as a PDF on the project website right afterwards. So stay tuned for that on the project webpage, or join us on Wednesday night at Randall. Okay, a couple more questions coming into the queue. We've got plenty of time for you, so if you've got a question, ask it now. We have a question here, again, for the folks living on South George Mason Drive with regard to parking for both residents and for vendors and others who might be visiting them. I think we pretty much handled this with the first question about parking, the first couple questions about parking, but we do want to, you know, when we think about short-term parking, when we think about long-term parking or residential parking, that is one of the trade-offs we are thinking about. Correct, Leah?
Yep.
Just, I guess that's
all. I
Go
can
ahead.
add something. I think this kind of goes back to something that was asked earlier. You know, there is kind of more room in, you know, segments 2 and 3, because there are those large medians that can be reduced in order to accommodate parking on both sides. Whereas in segment 1, there's only that 6-foot median, and we can't really take that away because then pedestrians would be walking across the whole road without having really any safe place to stop. So I think it also goes back to the fact that there's a little bit more room and flexibility to accommodate parking in segments 2 and 3 than segment 1. But I think, like Nate said, you know, short-term versus long-term parking is something we're considering, but also, you know, trade-offs to have a safe, you know, functional and efficient roadway based off, you know, planning guidance, interdepartmental coordination, and public engagement.
All right. Thanks, Leah. All right, back to me. I've got another question here. I think this one is useful, and it will come, we'll start with Leah and then probably go over to Tina for some background on the analysis. Is there any analysis on the traffic calming effect of each option? Would either bring the 85th percentile speed down? I think this is a great question. Leah, let's start with you.
That is a great question. So we can go through some of them, but any of the concepts that involve reducing the width of vehicular lanes generally will reduce speeds, especially in areas where there's a hill, which is generally where we're seeing a lot of speeding. You know, coming down from that hill on Wakefield, if you're heading north, there's a lot of speeding there. You know, we also have some issues with speeding around curves. So narrowing, you know, the widths, I think, would be a large, you know, component of that. Trying to think of some other, we haven't quite gotten to some of these spot improvements that we'll be looking at with the next phase. Tina, do you have any additional traffic calming we'd be looking at?
Yeah, I think just in terms of sort of the effect of that speed, you know, things that we're looking at are the bicyclist experience and pedestrian experience and what they're, Leah mentioned before, sort of the level of stress that they're experiencing. So by separating cyclists into that separated bike lane or the multi-use trail on the side of the road, you know, that really affects the sort of feel or impact of that speed. So and another thing Leah mentioned just in terms of motor speed along the road, you narrowing the lanes. Another thing really with all the options is that adding that buffer on the side and planting some trees there that provide some additional friction on the side of the road to encourage a reduction in speed as well.
And I just remembered, actually, Tina, from our walking tour, some people said that, you know, their experience, it feels sometimes when you're walking along it like it's a highway. So adding some of these, you know, trees, the planted buffer would make it feel, you know, more like a residential street, you know, which it is because people live along it. And then also just talking about something that we mentioned earlier, you know, Vision Zero. We're doing speed studies, you know, all throughout the county for any road that's 30 miles per hour plus. So we are working in coordination to possibly reduce the speed on South George Mason, which would hopefully affect the way people are driving.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Tina. All right, we're going to go into a multi-part question here, so hang with me. Allison, submitted a number of very conscientious thoughts, and I want to make sure we get through to them the way that we do. I think we've addressed the first one quite literally in the last sentence that you just spoke, Leah. Allison starts off with a question about speed limits. Has there been any consideration of lowering the speed limit throughout the corridor, particularly in segment 2, where a ton of kids cross George Mason to get to Randolph Elementary? I think we can comfortably answer that question with yes. As Leah mentioned, the Vision Zero team within our Transportation Engineering and Operations Bureau is currently undertaking a study of all roads with a speed limit of 30 miles per hour or higher. And you have seen a couple of those roads pop up on a recent county board agenda where we submitted and received a request to authorize advertisement of a speed reduction on 2 roads, one on South 5th Street near Carlin Springs Elementary, one on Fairfax Drive, which sounds like a big road, but isn't, because it's the section of Fairfax Drive from North Barton Street to Route 50 in Roslyn. And it's very much not a road you would expect to have a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. So you've seen a couple of those. That's part of that effort. So the answer to that is yes, and we are now coordinating with that effort for this study and sharing the speed data we gathered this year, as well as past speed data, and using that to inform a decision about speed that may come outside of the recommendations of this, outside of the actions of the study. So that may be something that TE&O does independent of any proposed changes to the corridor. Okay, on to the rest of your comment. Also, it seems like there's a lot to like in option B, but a couple of questions. For those biking southbound on the multi-use trail, how would they access westbound WNOD? And is it still that terrible crossing to turn right at 4 Mile Run Drive? So I think that, Leah, I think I know what you're going to say, but I will let you say it. Let's address that, and then we'll go to the last part of Allison's comment and question.
Yeah, that is a great question. We want to create a network of multi-use trails where you can safely connect. Similarly, when you connect to 4 Mile Run Drive or WNOD or Custis Trail, we are going to be looking at intersections, specifically at the South 4 Mile Run Drive intersection in the next phase, and we'll definitely be taking into account the turning movements of cyclists or pedestrians to connect to the WNOD. From this proposed trail if this concept moves forward, and then also looking at vehicular turning movements to see how we can minimize or totally take away conflicts. We want to make sure that this is a kind of a cohesive multi-use trail where you can connect easily.
I've gone and gotten confused about which screen I'm sending live. Sorry, Leah. Thank you for that. It's also a great place to highlight the order of operations of this study and why it's important to have a good idea of what the preferred concept is for each segment of the corridor or for the corridor at large before diving into intersection issues. We have to know what we're solving for once we get to those very complex movements at different intersections, and 4 Mile Run Drive at George Mason is one of those complex intersections. All right, the last bit of Allison's question has to do with park space. So for option B, how much park space, if any, would be lost at Alcova Heights Park and Doctors Run Park for the shared use path concept? And I'll bring that up here for segment 2 at Doctors Run.
Okay, so this is segment 2, concept B, which is that multi-use trail. So you can see there's, parking here 8 feet on each side. Once again, we have to figure out which concept to really move forward with. There will likely be some reduction in parking at intersections just to make sure that people can cross safely, but generally parking will be maintained along the park in this segment.
All right. We're going to jump up to the same concept in segment 1.
Yes, so you can see here that parking has been removed. And once again, this kind of goes back to the fact that there's a 6-foot median here. We're trying to stay kind of within this right of way. So the parking would be reduced, as you can see, adjacent to Alcova Heights Park. I should mention really quick, because I have spent a lot of time on this corridor recently. There is parking, behind the park, on side streets of the park, but we, do realize that people park here when visiting. But the hope would be that more people could ride transit, bike, or walk safely rather than having to drive to the parks.
All right, thanks, Leah. Going to jump into some more. We've gotten some more questions here. She meant, and Allison jumps in with a clarification. So before we move on to another subject, I will get to this. She said she meant the literal park itself. How much space would be lost in the parks themselves in this scenario, not necessarily the parking.
That's a good question. So you can see from this graphic here where it extends from the. So basically, I'm trying to do the math in my head. I believe it's a 4 foot. It's a 4 foot sidewalk with a 3 foot buffer, and so we're proposing a 6 foot buffer and 12 foot trail. So that would be. And
then this segment for the parking lane too.
Yeah. So this segment would mostly be extending not into the park, would be extending into the roadway. I also should mention we've been coordinating closely with Department of Parks and Recreation, and for specific parts like Alcova Heights, it would be very hard to extend into the park because there's a pretty steep slope and it would cause some drainage issues if we were to extend that way, which is why we're kind of talking about extending into the road rather than into the park. And that's a conversation that we're kind of maintaining throughout all of these segments.
Does that hold true, again, framing it as park, not parking for segment 2 concept B? Does appear that that is a bit different.
In the park. Also because there isn't as steep as a grade here, and it is generally flat. And there is some room. Once again, we're working with Department of Parks and Recreation to see, what we can do. We have, people that work in urban forestry and people that kind of work on like natural surface trails. So we're trying to balance, people, seeing the trail as an amenity to the park versus something that's infringing on park space, because if we do it correctly, I think it can be, something that's an asset.
Okay, great. Let's do this. We've got another question here about trade-offs. I think this is a good one. I'm going to put myself back on screen. Comment from one of our attendees tonight. Why are you putting more value on preserving a green median than the homeowners who will lose a lot of access to their homes? I assume we're using the word access here in reference to parking. Can we talk about trade-offs between the median in various segments and parking?
Yes, so we've been coordinating with other departments, and also one thing we heard from public engagement was that people valued the median because it brought a certain character to the neighborhood, kind of like we mentioned earlier with having trees and kind of a perception as less of a highway and more as a neighborhood street. So that is, something we can consider, but once again, it's about trade-offs of, do more people want to preserve the median and not have parking, or is it the other way around? Once again, we have a limited amount of space to work with and a lot of things to kind of put together so everyone can kind of get a little bit of what they want, but I think there's going to have to be some compromise, whether it's a median or parking or, travel lanes. There's going to have to be some compromise in order to make this a better corridor and align with the county's guidance. All
right. Let's jump into another quick question. I think we're going to get, I think I know the answer to this one too. A question from Linda. Will the identified left turn lanes at Columbia Pike and 4 Mile Run be maintained? I think we're going to get into this in the next phase of engagement, but I will pass it to you, Leah.
I think I'm just going to hand that one right to Tina.
All right, let's talk to Tina.
Hi. Yeah, so I think that's something that we are looking at in phase 3. I think one thing that's going to be important is phase 3, and Leah mentioned this, is going through all of the concepts, is looking at how the signals and intersections operate and who goes when, what lights they're getting. You know, are you turning when it's just a green circle that you're looking at, or just a green arrow? And we'll be getting into more details on that, and that I'm explaining all that because that impacts the need for those turn lanes, and turn lanes do have a lot of benefit from a safety perspective, which is a focus of this study. So don't have a direct answer, but something we will be looking at very closely in our phase 3 work.
And I do want to point out that we will be looking at it with your help, because there will be another phase of public engagement when we consider those intersections. So stay tuned. I've got a couple of comments in a row, so I'm going to read them. These are good comments. I appreciate them. From Yvonne. Yvonne hopes that the new developer of the Barcroft Apartments is engaged with the county as this project could impact development plans. Leah, do you have any comment on this matter?
Yes, that I'm going on a site visit with Jared Lynch, who's the developer for the Barcroft Apartments, tomorrow at 9 a.m. So we are talking with them about their role in making this kind of a better cross section in segment 2, and also about the, you know, possibilities there. So we are coordinating with them closely.
Thank you so much. Another comment, follow on from Jason related to his earlier question about precedent for multi-use trails alongside roadways in the county. He says it would be helpful to understand the frequent driveway interaction with a multi-use trail. That condition doesn't really exist on the Custis or W and OD as far as I know, and that's a great point. So thank you for sharing that. I'm sure we'll hear more about it as engagement moves along, but I really appreciate you raising that. You were right that it is a unique condition, particularly when we think about segment 3, because that is the segment where any proposed multi-use trail, and I'll go ahead and bring that up, would cross driveways and rather than being co-located with county public space. Okay, on to the next one. A note from Anonymous about ped refuges. There is currently no refuge for people crossing George Mason at Columbia Pike. Your point is correct and well taken, and we definitely heard about that in the online comment map for existing conditions. If I go ahead, I don't know that I have it quickly here. The comment map, and I encourage you to, I'm not going to make anyone else seasick by scrolling through this rapidly, but the comment map in the slide deck, which will be available after the meeting, does clearly show an intensity of comments at the intersection of George Mason and Columbia Pike. Okay, a quick question for Leah coming up next. We say, what is the timeline for implementing these proposed changes? And I'll caveat that by saying that there are no proposed changes yet. The proposed changes will be the outcome of this study, and that will occur at the end of the year. But Leah, can you tell us a little bit more about what will happen once the study is finalized?
Yeah, of course. So once this study is finalized at the end of the year, we will hopefully be able to submit an application for a grant for funding for that southern portion. So that's Columbia Pike South to the county line. We really can't say that there's a timeline right now because we're in such, it's just such a broad phase we're in right now, because that's really what a study is, kind of just getting a vision, getting a general concept. I think, you know, from a timing perspective, I could generally say that because we'll have a 15% design at the end of this study, that segment would be implemented before the northern segment most likely, but I can't really give a timeline at this time.
A lot of that does depend on funding too, which is the reason for that concept. So, all right. Back to yours truly. Q&A screen. Okay, another comment from Linda here. I'm going to go ahead and put that up on screen. Are you looking in particular at the intersection where kids from Barcroft cross to Doctors Run Park, walking up the path through the woods to Randolph Elementary School. We talk about any attention that that crossing has received from the study so far. Leah?
Yeah, so that is an area we're looking at because we're looking at areas where kids are crossing the school. So that's, you know, we have some 6th Street is another one we're looking at. We are looking at that. That'll once again come into play more so in the next phase when we are looking at crossings and intersections. But that is something we have on our radar.
Thank you very much. And I'm on down to my last 3 in the queue. So if you have other questions, now is the time. We have about 15 more minutes of discussion. We're happy to answer your questions at this time. If you have questions about the feedback we received in the first phase of public engagement, that might be a good topic. Any background on the data. And speaking of data, I will go ahead and jump in on this. We have a question here. What are the usage statistics for cyclists on the Route 50 to Columbia Pike segment that would justify a dedicated bike lane? I rarely see cyclists except in the pre-existing dual use lane. I rarely see cyclists in the pre-existing dual use lane except for the early weekend mornings. Leah, let's talk a little bit more about segment 1 and the George Mason Drive corridor status as a bike priority corridor. Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, great question. So I think the first thing, like Nate kind of mentioned, so we have, you know, this master transportation plan that really guides transportation throughout the county. South George Mason Drive is actually identified as a primary bicycle corridor, meaning that it should have kind of low stress bike facilities, whether that's a separated bike lane or a trail. So, you know, that's where a lot of this is coming from. But at the same time, what, you know, we heard from public engagement that was really interesting is, you know, just because there aren't bikes on it now, or there doesn't appear to be bikes on it now, doesn't mean people don't want to bike. We heard from a lot of parents at Wakefield who would want their kid to be able to, you know, bike to school, but they just didn't feel comfortable because it's not safe. We had, you know, some people talk about wanting to bike, but just taking other, you know, kind of out of the way roundabout routes because they didn't feel safe biking. So I guess this is all to say that, you know, through kind of planning guidance and then also what we've heard from the public, that led us to see really a need for a dedicated bike lane or a multi-use trail.
Thanks, Leah. Jump into the next one here. This one is also important from Hung. Has there been or will there be any attempts to reach out to BIPOC communities along the South George Mason Drive corridor study area to gain a better understanding of where users in these communities cross the street and how they use the road? So I think I can start with that. And then Leah, I would welcome you chiming in on this. But one of the reasons that we are translating our study materials into 6 additional languages is because we know that this is one of the most diverse corridors in the county when it comes to residents. Not to mention residents, but also businesses. It intersects with 4 Mile Run Drive. It intersects with Columbia Pike. And we know that there's a lot of people here for whom English is not their primary language. So we're trying to do different things with our public engagement strategies beyond simple digital opportunities and county communication channels. Leah, I'm going to ask you to touch on your stakeholder group that you're working with. But for my part, I will say that one of the things that we're trying and we've done with other projects and seen some success on is direct mail. It sounds not really that innovative, but one of the things we did for this phase of the study, because it is so important and because we want feedback from as many people as possible, is that we sent a mailer to 15,000 addresses, residential addresses along the postal routes of in and about South George Mason Drive for the purposes of reaching as many people as possible. It is scheduled to be in mailboxes this week with plenty of time to scan the code in your preferred language on the back of the postcard and respond to the online feedback form. So in addition to that, Leah has been working with a group of community stakeholders to get the word out from trusted sources. And we're also working with the county manager's office, who maintains a lot of relationships from efforts like the census and the complete vaccination committee to reach out to folks who do not, aren't signed up for transportation email notifications and don't follow us on Twitter. So it's definitely something we're thinking about here. Leah, I'll turn it over to you for the last bit.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Yeah, so I think the mailer was, how we were hoping to reach a lot of people who may not have time or, access to come to the in-person meeting. And we do have what's called a key community stakeholder group. So this is a group keeps increasing, I think about 50 individuals who represent various groups. So we have individuals from like Columbia Pike Partnership, civic associations, PTOs, we have some vice principals. We really just have, a lot of different people. We have some people from affordable housing that we're working with to kind of get the word out to people. So basically we have a meeting about a week in advance of public engagement to make sure we get them all the materials they need, and then they can kind of send those out through their channels. So we're working with them as well to reach as many, as many of the diverse groups that Nate mentioned along this corridor, because it is an equity emphasis area.
Thanks for that, Leah. All right, I think we're going to address this one quickly, and then there's another one I want to get into, and then something a little bit more specific. And then I think we're going to be close to the end, but if you have any other items you'd like to address in this Q&A session, please submit them now, and we'll do our best to fit them in. Okay, from Yvonne, I realize speeds along George Mason were documented in the presentation. Does the county have data that documents bike usage along George Mason? I know we sort of talked about this in the last one, but what we are seeing is not just the data on the ground of how many people are using South George Mason Drive as it exists today as a cycling route, but also the folks who indicated in our public engagement that they would like to, but they don't feel safe doing so. Leah, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, if that's a real question people have, we can, use portable bike counters. And then a good point was that we do have data on how many people are using cabbie bikes in the area. So that's something we can point to as well. And I can tell you that cabbie data is quite high.
Yeah, and then right on time, someone chimed in the Q&A with a comment that I went ahead and shared right after this question because it's relevant. To respond to the prior question, I for one would like presumed like to bike on this segment of George Mason, but it feels too unsafe in its current condition. There is definitely latent demand. All right, great. Someone on this call is one of the people we are referring to here. So Leah, I'm going to get into another question here that's a bit long, and I think that it is exhibiting some of the frustration with the amorphousness of the study. I think it's sometimes a challenging thing to talk about trade-offs, to talk about study conditions, to talk about what is conceptual, what is decided, how are we making decisions when people the real lived experience of people who live in, around, and on George Mason Drive can be affected by these decisions. So I've got one here from someone who's attending tonight that really gets into that. He says, every time you talk about trade-offs, what you are not saying is those of us who live on George Mason will get all the bad parts and others, quote, will get the good stuff. I support bike lanes, but I do not support it with so much loss to my home. You just talk about trade-offs with no actual specifics as to what homeowners, especially in segment 1, are supposed to do. You will not answer real questions as what we are supposed to do. You have not reached out personally to the homeowners. You have no proposals as to where contractors are supposed to park. How are we supposed to reserve space? So understanding that frustration exists, what is the role of this public engagement in informing the study, and what in the timeline are we going to get into where folks like that are going to see that consideration happen?
Yeah, thanks, Nate. So definitely understand that frustration, and I think that is kind of the product of being this, like I mentioned, study that's kind of very broad in a vision. So we would start reaching out to homeowners after this study, after we, think about what concept is possible, what intersections can look like. That's when we would start reaching out to homeowners. I mean, but that's what we're also doing now. reaching out to you to talk about what you do and what you don't like. We've been talking with civic associations who, you know, I've been to multiple civic association meetings to talk to those homeowners that live along South George Mason Drive. Unfortunately, right now, the trade-offs are looking a little nebulous because we really don't have anything concrete, because such is the nature of a transportation study. That's all to say that once things are more concrete, we will personally reach out to homeowners. As for the no proposals as to where contractors are supposed to park, I think that would kind of depend on your unique situation, and would be something we could talk about once we get into the more kind of specific transportation infrastructure phase past the study phase.
So what I want to highlight about Leah's response here, and I think this is important, is that the concepts that you see on screen are like a slice of the pie, right? If we pictured just any old slice of South George Mason Drive and applied concept A or concept B, this is what it quote unquote would look like. But that doesn't necessarily reflect the unique circumstances of each block, right? As the corridor proceeds, the physical right-of-way varies. The physical experience of the corridor as it exists today varies. And the opportunity for trade-offs, and what I mean by that is trade-offs that occur during this conversation we're having as part of the study, where people say we have limited off-street parking and no opportunities if parking were to be removed, where that conversation about trade-off changes for parts of the segment. So you're bringing up your concerns at the exact right time, and they will definitely be incorporated in the next steps for this project. So I just want to point that out, that you're raising your concerns at the right time and that no decision is being made today, nor until we get to towards the end of the study. So you're here, you're saying what you need to say at the right time, which is great. And we want to make sure that you are able to follow this study along with those of your neighbors who also have frontage on South George Mason, and make sure that people are informed. So we will continue to promote these opportunities for engagement and make sure that your feedback is bringing in. Okay. So a quick statement here from Linda Dye, and then we've got a couple more and we'll wrap up for tonight. As a reminder, you have the opportunity to share your feedback not only tonight, where the Q&A will be saved as a transcript and shared on the project page. You can also submit comments using the online feedback form. You can attend the meeting on Wednesday night at Randolph Elementary. And you can always reach out to the project team, either myself or Leah, and we will work on getting you an answer to your question or sharing feedback. Okay, so from Linda, one more. Strongly support increasing all 4-foot sidewalks to 6 foot. We're doing 6 foot under form-based code on Columbia Pike. But why the 6-foot planting strip / buffer? We do 4 foot under form-based code for the pike. Would provide 2 feet for other uses trying to fit into the overall width of the street. Leah, can you talk a little bit more about the importance of a 6-foot buffer?
Yeah, so I think the 6-foot buffer really provides separation from what we call more vulnerable users, like cyclists, people riding bikes, or pedestrians, because cars are going such high speeds. It provides more perceived protection, but then also actual protection. And then also from kind of a very technical tree component, trees generally need about 6 feet or more to be able to grow. And so if we want to have kind of like substantial tree canopy, which has benefits like reducing urban heat island effect and things like that, and providing shade, so when you're on the sidewalk, you're not directly in the sun. That's kind of, you know, the 2 reasons that we're really looking at that 6 feet.
I want to just really quickly bring up that in some of the conversations I've been a part of with DPR, they pointed out that the width of the buffer zone dictates what can be planted there. So I think that is a useful fact too.
I totally forgot to mention that our street typology in the MTP also has some recommendations for buffer width, which is also where this came from.
Great, thanks, Leah. Okay, a couple more from folks along segment 1. All right. Thank you for the response on the cyclist, but there seems to be a difference in usage versus expectation between segment 1 and the ones further south. We have one of the best bike trails in the area, the WNOD, that is a 2-minute bike ride from South George Mason Drive. Why not direct bike traffic towards the trails and away from cars? If George Mason Drive is now a cycling priority, what corridor is still a priority for vehicular traffic? Let's talk a little bit more about what cycling priority means and the county's vision for bicycling in the transportation network.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. That's a great question. You know, WNOD is a huge resource. I think the biggest difference between WNOD and South George Mason Drive is that we're trying to have, you know, east-west connections like WNOD, but also north-south connections for cyclists, which would be South George Mason Drive. So when we're looking at that bicycle master transportation plan, it basically has looked at the entire county and said, how can we connect people so they can get where they need to go east-west? And what do we need to add so that people can get where they need to go north-south? The reason that this study was chosen among, you know, kind of a variety of reasons was because it is one of the north-south connections that people use on, you know, riding bikes, but also transit, also driving and walking. So it is a multimodal study. So I understand the concerns about, you know, taking things away from cars, but I see it more as we're reallocating things so that all modes have an opportunity. Because right now, you know, South George Mason is dominated by cars, and there's really not an opportunity for people to have a safe walking or biking experience, which is why we're doing this multimodal study.
Awesome. Thanks, Leah. All right, and last, a couple of comments here I will read aloud. The first is from another resident on segment 1. Someone that lives on segment 1, I completely agree with the frustrations of the previous commenter. Frankly, we should not lose the ability to park in front of our homes just so that someone, quote, might start biking. It is completely impractical and it has a significant financial impact for us that you have not addressed at all. Thank you very much for sharing your feedback today. That is, again, between yourself and the previous commenter, definitely something we have noted in this conversation. I'm sure we will hear from you and your neighbors in the online feedback form. Please do share that opportunity, and we will move forward with that feedback in mind. Finally, from Yvonne, thank you for hosting this informative session. You're very welcome. A recording of this meeting will be posted as soon as is practical. Additionally, we will see you on Wednesday for the open house community workshop, where we can get into a few more details, take a look at some of the maps, and think a little bit more about which one of these concepts best serves different uses, minimizes certain trade-offs, and balances the goals, needs, and aspirations of everyone who uses South George Mason Drive. And then again, open now through August 7th, 2022 is the online feedback form. It's available in 7 languages. It's on the project page and will be in your mailboxes shortly. Did get 3 new things very quickly. Just comments, so I'm going to read them aloud before we wrap. First from Allison. From very frequent personal experience, biking on the WNOD adds 40 minutes round trip for me as compared to taking George Mason. I will bike George Mason if and when it is safe. The WNOD is not a practical alternative for my particular travel. That's great to hear. Lived experience can be one of those things that helps us balance our trade-offs. And another comment here, I agree that north-south connections for bike infrastructure is important. Great point. And then finally, another someone who lives right off George Mason Drive. I have experienced the quote bad parts of speeding cars almost killing me when I try to get around with a bike. Thank you for considering all residents, not just those with cars. All right, that's the end of the feedback queue. With that in mind, we very much appreciate all of your time tonight. Thank you so much for joining us in this kickoff meeting for the second phase of public engagement for the multimodal transportation study. Can't wait to meet some of you in person on Wednesday, and we are very much looking forward to your feedback in the online feedback form and moving forward into the next phases of this study. So on behalf of the project team, thank you again for your time tonight, and we will hear from you soon.